my talk today, I'll be exploring the question of what is the best dietary pattern to manage diabetes. I wanted to start with this quote. You may have heard this one before. Eat food, mostly plant, and not too much. I think a very valuable piece of nutrition advice, and I'll be referring back to this a little bit later in my talk. But first, I want you all to take a step back and just have a think about how you arrived here today at the Convention Centre. So we're all here at the same destination to learn about how we can manage our diabetes better. That's what we all have in common here today. But we haven't all arrived here the same way. Some people may have driven or used a taxi service. Others may have caught public transport. There may be some people in this room that were even able to ride a bicycle or walk to arrive here today at the Convention Centre. And you would all have individual reasons as to why you chose those methods of transport to suit you best for today, whether that was the distance you were travelling, whether that was financial, environmental reasons, or just personal preference. But regardless of the mode of transport, we're all here today at the same destination. And with that in mind, what I hope to explore the idea today in my talk is that can we achieve the same common goal of improving our diabetes management, but by potentially taking different routes or following different dietary patterns? So I'll start by discussing briefly some of the limitations and difficulties that can occur when performing nutrition research, have a look at the range of different dietary patterns that have been studied in relation to diabetes management, and then focus on what their common themes are, take a look at dietary recommendations in Australia and across the globe, look at what we're actually eating here in Australia currently, and then provide some practical tips that you can take away and implement in your own dietary patterns. And then finish by just touching on some future areas of nutrition research. So nutrition is a relatively new area of science still. There are studies being performed every day across the world. And I think it's important that we just are aware and acknowledge that there can be some difficulties when we're performing nutrition research, particularly in human subjects, and when we're looking for a long period of time. So people who participate in studies are everyday human beings like yourselves living in the real world. And it can be difficult sometimes to have a large group of people to follow a specific dietary pattern for a long period of time. And then there can also be some difficulties in accurately measuring someone's dietary intake. So for these reasons, among others, it's hard for nutrition studies, I guess, to definitively give us an answer of what is the best dietary pattern for health or for diabetes management. But what we can pull from the research are some really common, clear themes, and I'll elaborate on those a bit more in a moment. And I think also important to acknowledge that as humans, we're all very diverse creatures. We all have different genetics, we live in different environments, and perhaps there might be different dietary patterns that better suit certain people, certain groups of people, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. So this graph here was used recently in a presentation by Professor Timothy Crow, and it's looking at a range of different food items and their potential association with risk of cancer. So a red dot on the right side of the graph indicates studies which show an increased risk associated with that certain food item, and the green dots on the left side of the graph indicate studies which show a reduced risk of association of cancer. And there are some really clear themes that we can start to pull from research studies such as this one. If we were to look at bacon and salt, you can clearly see a lot more red dots against those food items, indicating studies which have shown a potential increased risk of cancer associated with those food items. If by comparison we look at some of these more plant-based food items down the bottom, so onions, olives, carrots, there are a lot more green dots next to those items, indicating potentially a reduced risk of cancer associated with those food items. And I think you'll all be happy to see some of these green dots here against wine and coffee, dose dependent, of course. And there are a range of different dietary patterns that have been studied in regards to diabetes management. So a large meta-analysis study from 2013, they looked at a range of different dietary patterns and they found that a low GI pattern, low carbohydrate, Mediterranean and a high protein dietary pattern were all found to improve HbA1c levels. There has been some more recent research in the area of low carbohydrate dietary patterns, specifically in a type 2 diabetes population, and there are some results emerging that this pattern may further assist for helping to keep blood glucose levels a bit more stable, helping to improve lipid levels and reduction in diabetes medication needs, but these studies are still fairly short term, so it'll be interesting to see if these results do translate in the long term as well. And I think important to note that the idea of a low carbohydrate strategy is not a new concept. You've probably all heard of the Atkins diet. It was quite popular in the 90s. It's a low carbohydrate dietary pattern. On this graph here, we also have the Zone diet, which is another low carbohydrate pattern. The Learn pattern is a low fat, and Ornish a vegetarian-based dietary pattern. And for this particular study, a bar which is below the baseline is indicating a participant who has lost weight on this specific dietary intervention, and a bar above the line indicates a participant who has gained weight. And if we were to look at all these different dietary patterns, a low carbohydrate pattern, low fat, vegetarian, for all of the patterns there is participants who do relatively well, at least in terms of weight reduction. There are people that remain stable, and there are actually participants who gain weight on these different dietary interventions. So I think really starting to highlight that perhaps there might be different dietary patterns which might suit some people better than others. All diets work for someone, but none work for everyone. And if you think back to that transport analogy I used at the start of my talk today, all of the different modes of transport will work to arrive here at the convention centre, whether you drive, whether you catch public transport or use a taxi. All of them will likely work for someone in the room, but they won't work for everyone for various reasons. So instead of perhaps trying to compare different dietary patterns, what if we were to look at what a range of positive dietary patterns actually had in common? And that's exactly what this review does here. If we were to look at a low carbohydrate, low fat, vegetarian, low GI, Mediterranean, paleo, and a mixed approach, which is closer to what our current dietary guidelines recommend, they seem like quite distinct, different dietary patterns, but they do share some clear common themes. And that's limiting our intake of refined starches and added sugars, limiting our intake of processed food items, certain fats, and they all have an emphasis on increasing our intake of whole plant foods, which nicely simplifies down to that opening message today of eat food, not too much, and mostly plant-based. Another large meta-analysis study looking at over 300 studies found some very similar common themes. So this one here is looking at a range of different food items and their association with chronic disease risk. It was found that plant foods were more protective than animal foods. Of our plant foods, interestingly, whole grain products were actually seen as even more protective than fruits and vegetables. Dairy had a neutral effect on chronic disease, red and processed meats increase risk of chronic disease. Tea was most protective and soft drinks least protective. And again, I think some clear common themes we can take from that research is promoting the intake of whole plant foods and reducing our intake of processed food items. So how does this compare to what our current guidelines recommend here in Australia? You've probably all seen this before, and some of you have heard me talk about this before in other education sessions. This is called our Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. It's our current dietary recommendations here in Australia. Inside this circle is actually a pie chart, and it shows us our 5 core food groups that are recommended to be eating from each day and what portions to provide us with adequate vitamins and minerals for good health. And if we were to look at the plant-based food groups on these recommendations, so our grain section, our vegetables and our fruit, they're actually making up the majority of our dietary recommendations, which is in line with the common themes from the research of promoting intake of plant foods. Our guidelines also recommend that we limit our intake of these sometimes processed foods, again in line with those common themes from the research. And if we take a look at some of the dietary guidelines from other countries across the globe, on the left I've picked out the Japanese dietary guidelines, and on the right we have the Greek dietary guidelines. And again, plant-based food items are making up the majority of these dietary recommendations. What's interesting with these 2 countries in particular, the traditional Japanese diet is higher in carbohydrate, whereas the traditional Greek diet is higher in plant-based fats. Yet even though these countries have different carbohydrate, different fat intakes, they both have some of the highest life expectancies in the world. And Japan in particular, with a higher carbohydrate traditional diet, actually has the highest life expectancy in the world. So I think perhaps again indicating that different dietary patterns may suit different groups of people better than others. So what are we eating today in Australia? Our guidelines recommend that 80% of our intake to come from those 5 core food groups and limiting our intake of processed foods to about 20% of our dietary intake. In reality though, we're actually only consuming on average about 65% of our energy coming from those 5 core foods, and that's where we find those protective whole plant foods. And as much as 35% of our energy intake coming from processed food options. And interestingly, that's where we'll find our sweeteners in our food supply is mostly in those processed food options. This graph here is having a look at our macronutrient intake here in Australia, so our intake of carbohydrates, fats and protein. If I can draw your attention to the green bar that's representing our carbohydrate intake here in Australia. And most people find it interesting to know that we don't have a particularly high carbohydrate diet in Australia. The average adult consumes about 45% of their energy intake from carbohydrates, whereas our guidelines recommend that we could be consuming somewhere between 45 and 65% energy from carbohydrates. So our diet isn't a particularly high carbohydrate one, but I think it's just as important that we focus on the quality of those carbohydrate foods as well. So increasing our intake from those whole plant foods, carbohydrate sources, limiting intake from refined carbohydrate sources. And this graph here is looking at our vegetable intake here in Australia, and unfortunately it's not a very good picture. Less than 7% of us adults are actually achieving our adequate vegetable intake each day. And often when we are performing studies and surveys, collecting dietary information, often people actually over-report their intake of vegetables. So this 7% may even potentially be a little bit of an overestimate. So certainly some room for improvement in increasing our intake of vegetables in Australia. So regardless of which dietary pattern you're choosing to follow to help you manage your diabetes, whether that's a low GI dietary pattern, low carbohydrate, high protein, Mediterranean base, let's focus on what these dietary patterns have in common. And that's increasing our intake of whole plant foods, reducing our intake of processed food options. So what does this mean from a practical point of view? My first piece of advice for you today is to up the veggies. Try and get as many vegetables into as many meals and snacks as you can across the day. Keep the skin on to boost your fibre intake and your nutrient intake. Why not try tomatoes with basil on whole grain toast for breakfast in the morning? When you have a bit more time, perhaps on a weekend, you might cook up an omelette with some fresh herbs, some mushrooms. For your lunch meals, aim to bulk your sandwiches with at least 3 different types of salad vegetables. Perhaps during the winter you have a nice bowl of hearty vegetable soup, and aim to fill 50% of your dinner plate with vegetables at night time. And don't forget the snacks as well. If you have hunger between meals, snacks are a great way to boost your vegetable intake. Raw veggie sticks with some healthy dip like we've had for morning tea today is a great option. Some spiced dried chickpeas, even munching on a corn on the cob, or some whole grain crackers with some vegetable toppings. Let's make sure by the time we have another Australian health survey, more than 7% of us are achieving our adequate vegetable intake each day. My second tip is to eat whole grains. Often I'll be asked by clients of what exactly is a whole grain product. So a grain kernel has 3 parts to it: the bran, the endosperm layer, and the germ. The bran is the outer layer of the grain. It contains most of the fibre as well as a range of different vitamins and minerals. The endosperm contains the majority of the carbohydrate and the protein of the grain and lower levels of nutrients. And the germ contains the fatty acids as well as other vitamins and minerals. When a grain is refined and processed, often only the endosperm part actually remains. So we're left with a grain which is much lower in fibre, much lower in vitamins and minerals as well. So I encourage you to look for true whole grain products when you're shopping. These are some key words that you can look for on your products to help indicate the amount of whole grain that is in that product. So looking for words such as wholemeal, multigrain can help you when you're shopping. My third tip, make nuts a daily dose. So about a handful a day. Unsalted is what's recommended. Raw or dry roasted is fine. Nuts are a great source of fibre, healthy unsaturated fats, and they contain plant sterols as well, which have been shown to help with cholesterol levels. Walnuts in particular provide you with a source of omega-3 fatty acids, and almonds provide a source of calcium. Nuts are a really convenient snack option. You don't need to keep them under refrigeration, so they're great to take with you when you're on the run, and you can add them into meals as well. Using nuts in a stir fry, maybe adding them to your salads or muesli in the morning works really well as well. My fourth tip is to watch your meat intake, and this is particularly in reference to processed meats and red meats. Try and replace at least 1 meat meal each week with a vegetarian protein alternative, and there are lots of good options available. You can use eggs to make a frittata or an omelette. Chickpeas work well in a curry perhaps, or lentils making a dal. Tofu and nuts substitute in quite well for a stir fry recipe, and then using all the different range of lentils, kidney beans, butter beans into soups and salads. And I put the challenge to you today of adopting Meatless Monday in your households. So at least 1 day each week with using a vegetarian protein alternative. Tip number 5, spice up your life. What I mean by this is swapping ready-made sauces, ready-made condiments with fresh herbs and spices instead. You'll cut back on your intake of added sugars and added salts, and you'll be also adding in extra plant-based food items. These are just some flavour suggestions on the slide. I encourage you to experiment with different flavour combinations, find what is pleasing to you and what suits your taste preferences. So you might want to try having some mint or ginger with some lamb, maybe some lemon or lime with your fish. Don't forget the vegetable dishes as well. Basil, garlic pairs well with tomato, ginger with your carrots, or maybe some thyme with your mushrooms. And if you can grow your own fresh herbs at home, you'll save a lot of money that way as well. Tip number 6, you may have heard this one before, shop the perimeter. For most supermarkets, their layout is to place those core food items around the exterior of the supermarket. So if we look at this diagram up here, we have our fruits, our vegetables, our grains, meat, dairy, all around the outside of the supermarket. You may need to duck into some aisles for your whole grain products or for your spices, or perhaps if you're trying to increase your step count, but otherwise try and stick to the perimeter, or maybe you walk around the outside of the supermarket in the car park. By the time you get to the checkout, you'll find you've got a lot less packaged processed food items in your trolley if you can stick to the outside. And my final tip today is to move your body. And Thomas has already explained all of the wonderful benefits of exercise for diabetes management. Our bodies were designed to move, so I encourage you to look for opportunities every day to be active in your daily life. Whether that's when you're watching television at night time, getting up for the commercial breaks and moving around, going for a walk in your lunch breaks at work, or even just part of your lunch break. Take the stairs, over the elevators if you're able to. And when you're catching up with a friend, why not set a walking date? Rather than sitting down, having a cup of coffee at a cafe, go for a stroll instead. If you're looking for a new challenge, perhaps you take up a new sport or a new exercise class. Whatever it is that you do for movement and for exercise for yourself, as Thomas has already said as well, try and find something that you enjoy and that fits into your daily way of life, because it's much more likely that you'll create a habit and a new routine that way. So I just wanted to finish by briefly touching on some areas of future direction in nutrition research. So as I've said, there may be different dietary patterns which better suit different groups of people. But how do we know what is best for whom rather than perhaps a trial and error approach? There are some areas of nutrition research looking into how we can provide perhaps more individualised advice. One of those areas is providing advice based on our genetics. So you may have heard the terms nutrigenetics or nutrigenomics before. So nutrigenetics is a study looking at how our gene variations modify our response to diet, and nutrigenomics is looking at how nutrients themselves may affect our gene expression. There are some companies that are currently offering gene testing for nutrition advice. However, it is quite expensive, and experts are debating whether we currently have enough knowledge to provide useful and accurate dietary advice based on this testing. So watch this space, but I probably would err on the side of caution at present. Another area, and Professor Young mentioned this as well, is around nutrition advice based on our gut bacteria. So all of us have bacteria that lives in our gastrointestinal tract. Most of these bacteria feed on fibre from those whole plant foods. And there have been studies already which have shown associations between our gut bacteria and our intestinal health, immune-related diseases, and even studies that have looked at how our gut bacteria may impact on the way that we metabolize glucose and our blood glucose response after a meal. Again, there's still a lot of knowledge and research in this area that needs to be done to first, I guess, properly identify which bacteria are associated with which health outcome, and then how can we successfully populate that healthful bacteria in our gastrointestinal tract. So again, watch this space for future nutrition research. So my take-home messages for today is that nutrition research can be difficult in humans. There is more than one dietary approach which has been shown to be effective in managing diabetes. And note that different dietary patterns may suit different people better than others. Let's focus on what those positive dietary patterns have in common, which is increasing our intake of whole plant food and reducing our intake of processed food items. And note that in Australia, we eat too few vegetables and too many processed food items. And my practical tips for you today, and these are applicable regardless of which dietary pattern you're following to suit you best to manage your diabetes. That's up the veggies, select whole grain products, make nuts a daily part of your dietary pattern, watch your meat intake, use fresh herbs and spices to flavour your food rather than processed sauces, stick to the perimeter when you're shopping and look for opportunities to move your body each day. And I think if you can walk out of here today with even one or two small things that you'd like to change based on what you've heard, whether that's maybe having a look at your overall intake of sweeteners, whether that's thinking about opportunities you can incorporate to exercise or move your body more, or how you can eat whole plant foods. If you can walk out of here with even one or two small things that you'd like to change, I think all the presenters today would be very happy with that outcome. And if I can finish with this quote again, eat food, mostly plants, not too much. I think a really valuable, simple piece of nutrition advice that we can all heed to. These are my references for the studies that I've mentioned in my presentation, if anyone would like to do some further reading. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening and for your attention.